You wake up, go to work, pay your bills, and you live your life. You're told you have freedom, choice, and even a voice. But let me ask you something. Who actually holds that power? Because the more you start connecting the dots, the more you realize the biggest decisions shaping your life, they aren't happening in voting booths. They're happening in boardrooms, investment firms, and private networks that you'll never see. We're talking about companies that own pieces of almost everything. People who built platforms that now control data, communication, and even behavior. Tight-knit circles of individuals who keep showing up at the center of power again and again and again, no matter what side of the aisle has the lead. This isn't about secret meetings and dark rooms. This is about influence that's out in the open, but so big and so complex that most people never really stop to question it. In this episode of PSIND, we're breaking down how a single financial giant became embedded in nearly every major company, how a small group of tech insiders, what some call the PayPal Mafia, went on to shape the modern world, and how figures like Peter Thiel sit at the intersection of data, money, and politics, and where history, myth, and reality collide when we talk about names like the Rothschilds. No conspiracy theories, no fluff, just one question for you. Are we really in control, or are we just living inside a system built by people we were never meant to meet? So let's start with something real, something documented, and something that you can actually look up. Because before we even get into networks, tech, or influence, we need to talk about money. Not your paycheck, not your rent. I'm talking about the kind of money that quietly shapes entire industries. There's this company that's named BlackRock. Most people have never heard of it, but it might be the most powerful financial institution on the planet. BlackRock manages over $9 trillion in assets. That's not just cash sitting in a vault. That's ownership, stakes, and pieces of companies. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, major banks, major energy companies, and most healthcare companies. Chances are, if it's a major company, you'll find BlackRock somewhere on the shareholder list. But here's where it gets interesting. They don't run these companies in a traditional sense. They're not the CEO, and they're not on stage making announcements, but they own pieces of everything. So ask yourself, if one firm has a stake in thousands of companies, including competitors in the same industry, what does competition actually look like? And who really benefits when entire markets move in the same direction? Because it goes deeper than just ownership. BlackRock operates a system called Aladdin. It's a risk management platform used by governments, banks, and major institutions around the world. It tracks markets, predicts risk, and analyzes trends at a level most people can't even comprehend. So now you have a company that owns massive portions of the market, but it also helps analyze and guide decisions within that same market. Again, this is not a conspiracy. This is influence at a scale most people never even think about. But here's the thing. BlackRock didn't vote. BlackRock wasn't elected. But its decisions ripple through economies, industries, and your everyday life. From your retirement account to gas prices, to the companies hiring or laying people off. This is what real power starts to look like. Not loud, not obvious, but just deeply embedded in everything. Now let's shift from the money side of things to something just as powerful: networks. Because sometimes power isn't about one company, it's about a group of people who keep showing up at the center of everything. Back in the early 2000s, there was a startup called PayPal. At the time, it was just another tech company trying to survive the dot-com era. But behind the scenes, it was stacked with talent. After PayPal was sold, something interesting happened. That same group of founders and early executives didn't just disappear. They went on to build, fund, or influence some of the biggest companies in the world. Companies like Tesla, LinkedIn, Palantir, YouTube, venture capital firms that fund the next generation of startups. Different companies, same circle of people. That group later got a nickname: the PayPal Mafia. Not because they were some secret organization, but because of how often the same names kept reappearing at the highest levels of power. And this is where the idea of influence starts to evolve. Because it's not just about what you build, it's about who you know, who you invest in, and who you put in position next. Think about it. If the same small network of people is funding new companies, advising leadership, and backing certain political candidates, and shaping the direction of technology, then their influence doesn't just stay in one place. It spreads quietly, consistently, and over time. And the average person, you don't see the network. You just see the products, the app, and the headlines. But behind a lot of it, you'll find the same connections, the same circles, the same people sitting in a different room, and that just raises a bigger question. In a world that feels massive and decentralized, how much of it is actually being shaped by a very, very small connected group? Now, let's zoom in, because within that network we just talked about, there are individuals whose influence stretches even further. One of the most interesting but controversial is Peter Thiel. He's not just a businessman, he's a connector between worlds: tech, finance, politics, data. Thiel was one of the co-founders of PayPal, an early investor in Facebook, the founder of Palantir, a company that works closely with governments, intelligence agencies, and large institutions. That's where things start to shift, because now we're not just talking about money, we're talking about information, data, patterns, behavior. Palantir isn't a social media app. It's not something that you casually scroll. It's a platform designed to analyze massive amounts of data, to find connections, predict outcomes, and support decision making at the highest levels. It's used for counterterrorism, law enforcement, military operations, and government analysis. So now think about the position that creates. Someone who has deep roots in Silicon Valley, access to massive financial networks, and involvement in systems that process and interpret real-world data at scale. That's a different kind of influence. That's not loud, that's not always visible, but it is incredibly powerful. And then there's the political side. Peter Thiel has funded candidates, supported movements, and backed ideas that challenge traditional systems. Whether you agree with him or not, that's not the point. The point is, this is what modern power can look like. It's no longer just politicians making decisions. It's people who sit behind the scenes, funding, building, and shaping the tools those decisions rely on. So when you combine money, network, and data, you don't just influence the system, you help define it. So the question becomes, where does innovation end and control begin? Now we need to talk about something different. Not a company, not a modern tech figure, a name: the Rothschilds. Because when people start talking about power, influence, and money, this name almost always comes up. And this is where things can either make it stronger or completely lose credibility. So let's separate fact from fiction. Historically, the Rothschild family was one of the most powerful banking dynasties in Europe. We're talking 18th and 19th centuries. They built a network of banks across multiple countries, funding governments, influencing financial systems, and playing a real role in shaping early global finance. That part is not debated. They were powerful, they were influential, and at one point in history, they were at the center of major financial movements. But if you fast forward to today, the internet has taken that history of the Rothschilds and turned it into something else entirely. You'll hear claims that they control everything, that they secretly run global systems, and that every major event somehow traces back to them. But here's the reality. There's no credible evidence supporting those claims. What exists instead is a mix of historical truth, exaggeration, and in many cases, narratives that have been used to target and blame groups of people unfairly. But that matters because if you're trying to expose real influence, you can't mix it with misinformation. It weakens the entire conversation. So instead of asking, do they control everything? I think a better question would be, why do certain names become symbols of power? And why do people gravitate towards simple explanation when the real system is complex, layered, and even harder to understand? Because yeah, it is easier to point to one name than to unpack an entire network of institutions, money flows, and decision-making structures. But that brings us back to the bigger picture. Real power in this world isn't one family. It's not one group. It's systems, it's network, and it's influence spread across finance, technology, and data, working together in ways that most people will never fully see. So now we step back, because none of this matters if it doesn't connect to your life. And the truth is, it does, more than most people realize. We've talked about a financial giant with stakes in nearly everything, a network of tech insiders shaping entire industries, individuals sitting at the intersection of money, data, and politics, and how easy it is to confuse real influence with myth. So where does that leave you? Because you still wake up, you go to work, you pay your bills, and you try to get ahead. But the system you're operating in, it's not as simple as it looks. Markets aren't just supply and demand anymore. They're influenced by a massive institution moving billions at a time. Technology isn't just convenience, it's data collection, behavior tracking, and decision shaping tools. And leadership, it's not just elected officials, it's also the people funding campaigns, building platforms, and designing systems those officials rely on. So the real question isn't, is someone controlling everything? It's this. How much influence is concentrated, and how much of it operates without you ever noticing? Because most of it doesn't look dramatic. It looks like the apps you use every day, the companies you trust, the headlines you read, and the prices you pay. It's subtle, it's consistent, and it's built into the structure of how things work. That doesn't mean you're powerless, but it does mean something important. Understanding the system is the first step to seeing it clearly, because once you start paying attention, you stop taking everything at face value. You start asking better questions. And maybe that's the point of this entire podcast. Not fear, not outrage, but awareness. Because whether you like it or not, you are inside the system. And the only difference is, do you see it for what it is, or are you just moving through it like you have cruise control on?